You probably wouldn't be able to tell just by looking at them, but Majora's Mask and Fallout New Vegas have a lot more in common than you would think. Both of these games were made after the games in their series that completely changed the way they had done things previously. Ocarina of Time brought the Zelda series into 3D and created mechanics that would change the way 3D adventure games would be made forever. Fallout 3 changed the series drastically. Instead of a top-down RPG, it was turned into a first-person shooter and had an open world like nothing before it. Both Majora's Mask and New Vegas had a development time of a little over a year and reused the same engine from their previous titles. This led to both of these games reusing assets and mechanics. Both of these games were commercial successes, with many going as far as to say that they're better than the games that came before them. I can't help but feel that if these games were made today, they wouldn't be held in such high regard. There seems to be a big stigma about reusing things from previous titles for new entries. Some see it as being lazy or see it as a way of attempting to capitalize on the success of a good idea. It's an easy target, but I think the most well-known example of this is the Pokemon series. Aside from some outliers, Pokemon has been using the same battle system since the very beginning. Ever since its mainline games hit 3D in 2013, it's been using the same models and animations, and Pokemon gets a lot of shit for doing this. The latest Zelda entry at the time of writing this is Tears of the Kingdom. Much like Majora's Mask, it uses its predecessor's engine and its combat mechanics, even going as far as to reuse the way the story is told. This game was of course well received. I personally wasn't the biggest fan of Tears of the Kingdom, and it comes down to some of the things that were reused from Breath of the Wild. More on that later. There are tons and tons of examples that I can list. Here are just a few that I haven't mentioned. So what's going on here exactly? Why are there some games that can reuse concepts that are beloved and others that are seen as lazy? I think the answer comes down to how these ideas are repurposed or reimagined in ways that make them feel new. Because at the end of the day, regardless if a game reuses things, a good game is a good game. Finding the similarities between Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask isn't hard. Looking at these games side by side, it would be easy for someone who isn't familiar with them to assume they are the same game. Yet despite this, both games offer very different experiences. Majora's Mask takes what Ocarina of Time did and turned it into something new and exciting. Termina is a completely different world to explore than Hyrule, with a brand new story that has little to do with Ocarina of Time. Link's different forms he can take on makes traversing the world extremely fun, as he can adapt to different situations depending on the mask he uses. Of course, the 3-day cycle is also a big difference from Ocarina of Time. Having a looping period of time where you can learn all of the NPC's schedules and find ways to help them with the problems you see them face is a great way to have a player grow attached to your characters. Majora's Mask is also praised for it being one of the darker games in the Zelda franchise, and I think it's great as well. The different tones between Majora's Mask and Ocarina of Time really does play a big part in differentiating the two games. The stories are, of course, different, but the way they're told is completely different as well. All of these things are why people don't see Majora's Mask as a project that was made to capitalize on the success of its predecessor solely by reusing its assets and mechanics. So what would be an example of a game that does what Majora's Mask does with Ocarina of Time, but not so well or to a detriment even? I can think of two examples. The first one is low-hanging fruit, but I think it helps my point very well. The mainline Pokemon games have been using the same combat system since forever. Sure, they've added things and made changes to the mechanics, such as adding hold items in Gen 2 and the physical special split in Gen 4, but these changes were made well over a decade ago, and playing the actual battles has more or less been the same experience. I think people would point to Mega Evolution, Z moves, Dynamaxing, and Terrestrializing as ways that changed battles, but the overall experience remains the same. I think people would say that this is just the way Pokemon is, but other franchises like Final Fantasy have been able to take the turn-based battle system and create mechanics that make each game a different experience. That being said, the spin-off Pokemon games do exist and offer different styles of gameplay than the mainline series, but I still think there are opportunities to take the mainline series to more interesting places. It also doesn't help that almost every Pokemon game has the same story beats and elements. In the 3D era of Pokemon, seeing the same models and animations for certain Pokemon has become stale in its own right. Reusing models is fine, but it's been over a decade since X and Y came out. I think they can afford to at least touch up the models with some new textures or different animations. The other game I was thinking of was The Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom. Not for the same reasons as Pokemon though. Before I talked about how Majora's Mask's story was structured differently than Ocarina of Time's story, and its way of telling the story was new as well. The thing with Tears of the Kingdom is that its story and Breath of the Wild's story are told in way too similar fashions. The stories themselves are different, but when I played Tears of the Kingdom after Breath of the Wild, I started to feel like I was just going through the motions. It had been 6 years since I played Breath of the Wild when I played Tears of the Kingdom, mind you. Viewing the memories in Tears of the Kingdom felt just like viewing Link's memories in Breath of the Wild. I also wasn't exactly thrilled when I had had to view what was essentially the same cutscene after each of the bosses in the temples. So not only was the story repetitive in the sense that it had the same structure as Breath of the Wild, but it was also repetitive in its own way. Now compare everything I said regarding Pokemon and Tears of the Kingdom to how Majora's Mask was to Ocarina of Time. Majora's Mask, while reusing things from Ocarina of Time, was still able to create new mechanics, a new world, and a new story, as well as a new way of telling said story, in a way that made it feel like a completely different experience than Ocarina of Time. Just like Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask, Fallout 3 and Fallout New Vegas could easily be mistaken as the same game when looking at them side by side. These two games have very little differences in the gameplay department, but people still see New Vegas as the superior game. Personally, I've never really seen anyone complain that the two games are too similar. It's easy to see why though. These games are massive open world games and both their worlds are 100% different. The ruined DC of Fallout 3 is a way different wasteland than that of New Vegas' Mojave. The stories are completely different too. The most notable difference between the two games that seems to make New Vegas the top dog for some people is the story and side quests, more specifically how they play out. Fallout New Vegas has 4 different endings depending on which faction you decide to side with at the end of the game. It's not as simple as that, however. You can still gain favor with the other factions, resulting in different outcomes for what happens to the factions after the battle at Hoover Dam. This also extends into the side quests as well. There are multiple ways side quests can be completed. You may finish a side quest but learn that there were optional things you could have done to see different outcomes. It's way deeper than I'm making it out to be though. It's not just 1 or 2 different outcomes most of the time. It's the slight deviations you can make that can alter a story's result. There's also the things that New Vegas was able to refine from Fallout 3. Things like looking down your sights, crafting benches, and an increased number of weapons over Fallout 3 makes New Vegas the better game for a lot of people. So while New Vegas is using the same engine as Fallout 3, New Vegas takes what it's given and is able to make a more complete experience for the player. It seems that as time has gone on, people have become a lot less forgiving when it comes to new games reusing things from previous games. I think it's fair to expect a certain quality in the games we buy, but I think people get a little too hung up on the fact that things are reused and not how they're reused. I harped on Tears of the Kingdom for its repetitiveness and how its story is told, but it also reuses the same combat mechanics as Breath of the Wild as well. The fusing mechanic easily makes what is Breath of the Wild's combat into a way more entertaining experience. Fusing items to your different weapons for various effects makes each combat encounter different in its own right. It also opens up more possibilities for interacting with the world. If you look at discussions about Tears of the Kingdom, you'll rarely find people complaining that Hyrule is the same as it was in Breath of the Wild, because they're having too much fun making their own vehicles to traverse the world with. Of course, there are cases where things are reused over and over again without being transformed in any way to the point where they become stale. In the end though, a great game is loved because of the experience it provides to the player. The reusing of elements from other games shouldn't matter if they provide a memorable and fun experience for the person playing the game.